Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, Patrick Bond. He joins us in the studio. Very good evening to you. Thanks so much for joining us, Patrick. Let's just first start with the tone, the posture of the visit. I think we've mentioned this, a flurry of diplomatic efforts by various Western countries who seem to be wanting to court favor, as it were, with particularly South Africa, which has taken a non-aligned position. So we saw what seemed to be a very emphatic statement by the Minister of International Relations and Corporations about not taking a side, but how would that have gone down, behind closed doors?
Yes, well, I don't know what Naledi Pandor has been communicating in the last few days, but certainly as the foreign minister, she has played the neutral position very strongly. And I think Janet Yellen's visit is partly, as you saw in the clip, the Just Energy Transition Partnership. It's partly that they don't want to see the BRICS and BRICS Plus offer an alternative to the dollar. But I think they're trying to shore up a very delicate problem they've created, which was to put on quite effective financial sanctions. And that included dropping Russia from SWIFT, the international payment system, and freezing assets. And the unintended consequences, no one would, kind of put their money into places where the dollar, where they're vulnerable to that sort of pressure. So, for example, China is selling its treasury bills fairly steadily now. And there is talk that the BRICS will become a site in August in Durban for a potential new international financial arrangement where the US dollar is not as the hegemonic currency anymore.
And do you think, from where Janet Yellen sits, it's a real threat?
Yes, she knows that the world financial system was constructed, ironically, with Jan Smuts's government in 1944, in alliance with the US in a place called Bretton Woods, where the World Bank and IMF were founded, but they put the US dollar 35 to 1 ounce of gold, and kind of half the gold was in the US in Fort Knox, half the gold was underneath our feet in Johannesburg. So this was the sort of alliance at that time. It broke in 1971. Richard Nixon defaulted because there were too many dollars abroad and not enough gold. And then it's been very unstable. So we had all these ups and downs and currency crises. Janet Yellen's an economist. She had been the Federal Reserve Chair. She's in a scandal at the moment because it's just been revealed that when she was a very high-ranking official, she was threatening the US working class with unemployment, and the monetary policy sort of followed that. And her boss then, Alan Greenspan, was very happy. So there's a kind of a controversy in which the role of these economists in shoring up a monetary system that serves especially US financial interests is controversial. She's going to have to tiptoe, but she can do it. She's a sort of centrist politician with great skills. So
we'll come back to that scandal on the job security memo, but I just want to come back to the financial sanctions aspect, South Africa's role. There's a whole issue of grey listing. What would have been the conversation around that?
Well, the US Treasury is very central to, firstly, the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements and their agency, the Financial Action Task Force. And they met in Morocco last week. We don't know if the acting the acting Director General, Ismail Mohamed, persuaded them that South Africa has now taken measures against illicit financial flows and terrorist financing. And Janet Yellen will be very concerned at that level. It was, recall in the 2001 bombing of the World Trade Center that this whole sort of monitoring of world finance began, and bank accounts of Islamic terrorists were, this was the sort of process. And it does turn out that South Africa is very loose. Our Treasury, our Reserve Bank have been asleep at the wheel. We've had massive capital outflows, mostly big business, up to 7% of GDP a year, according to Treasury. And so I do think it's probably helpful if we are put under that grey listing pressure simply to keep more money in the country.
So the $8.5 billion US Just Energy Transition Partnership with the United States, that would have been the center of discussions with the Energy Minister, Gwede Mantashe. But I'm just curious, in that vein of quid pro quo, or the carrot stick situation, around Russia, Ukraine, and what South Africa would get in turn. Do you think that there is that kind of trade-off in those discussions, even though it may be intimated but not said?
I wish I knew. If I look closely at what that $8.5 billion is all about and what the US is bringing to the table, it's not impressive. So it's not really a very strong stick to withhold, or it's not a very tasty carrot. And the reason is the US is usually the most stingy. And it's not really just Joe Biden's a corporate neoliberal. It's that whole Congress, especially now this year, it's turned far to the right in the House of Representatives. They really are still in a climate denialist and especially climate debt denialist. No, they're not really wanting to pay. John Kerry even said it last week. He's their climate czar. He said, we have no liabilities. So they're sort of rejecting the basic principle of environmental management called polluter pays. And that means if they give money, it's not really a gift. It's a market rate loan. And the only subsidization that Janet Yellen, as the Treasury Secretary, has put into this is to do a bank guarantee to make sure more commercial banks come in. But we pay very high interest rates, about the fourth highest in the world among the countries issuing bonds. So we'd be probably still being 10, 11, 12% for that $1 billion. I don't think she can threaten to withdraw it, especially because the finance minister here, Enoch Godongwana, and energy minister Montashe are quite notoriously pro-coal. They don't really, want that money that much.
Mm-hmm. And you've said you feel that the visit itself, it was devious. Your thoughts on why?
Well, she is like Anthony Blinken, who was here in August, and probably Biden will arrange some visit before his first term ends. These are politicians who come to South Africa partly for their own prestige, and in that sense, to be able to speak with the most powerful diplomatic corps in Africa. And Naledi Pandor, we don't know if she'll be reshuffled because she's not on the National Executive Committee, but she certainly has had that stature of being a very tough, from the ANC tradition of anti-imperialism. Would sometimes with the BRICS as the sort of alternative, it's sometimes postured that there could be this major restructuring of world finance and reform of the International Monetary Fund, reform of the World Bank have been, again, postured. Nothing much has been done. We don't really even have this contingent reserve arrangement that the BRICS had set out to put together as an alternative to the IMF. We went to the IMF in 2020 for $4.3 billion. And also the World Bank, we have an alternative, the BRICS Bank, but it's not really different in any way. We don't have an alternative credit rating agency as promised. There are many ways in which this BRICS monetary financial reform agenda has been overhyped. But this year may be different. The next 6 months could tell whether having Saudi Arabia, the petrodollar site, Iran, its traditional enemy, again, sanctions victim from the US, UAE hosting the summit. These are all countries, along with Kazakhstan, Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, Senegal, Indonesia, that are very carbon intensive and oil rich, coal rich, and they will be coming here to Durban, their leaders, to possibly join the BRICS this year. And it's a moment where, of course, the West and the European Union's foreign minister, Joseph Borrell, is here. They're really going to be quite concerned to make sure that they make an appealing pitch to South Africa.
All right, just a quick one. So back to that whole Janet Yellen scandal on job security memo. So I think I read somewhere along the lines of her wanting to collapse collective bargaining for workers. Just explain a little bit more.
It is so ironic because in some ways, in the whole spectrum of US economic managers, she would be center or center left. And yet when she was writing this memo to Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve head, she really explicitly said we can keep inflation down by breaking working class power. And in fact, that was very much underway. I happened to live in the US. I even worked in the Fed in the 80s, and it was extraordinary how quickly the workers, the unions especially, were pummeled. And she was, in fact, celebrating it as a way to keep inflation low. And to have that in such an explicit manner, it's kind of like a Marxist thesis that the monetary policy becomes part of a class struggle. And there it is, written down by Janet Yellen. So there's a lot of eyes raised about, well, really, whose side is she on? The mass of people who've been taking, wage cuts for 40 years in the US.
What fallout do you think there'll be as a result?
Well, I think Joe Biden has this reputation of being pro-labor, and maybe he'll have to work much harder for potential re-election. I mean, you know, the tragic thing is in the US, workers who feel let down by the Democratic Party have gone to Donald Trump because of his kind of populism and anti-elitism. It's happening all around the world. So we'll all learn some lessons from this.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Patrick. Much appreciated. Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Patrick Bond, just speaking to us about that visit by Janet Yellen.